So these are the slides for the second half of our case study on the US-Mexico border. We're looking more at contemporary events, but we're still thinking about contemporary events as historically constructed. So I start with Sicario. This is an image from Sicario, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's a film by Denis Villeneuve. It was made in 2015. And I recommend that you start with the material posted in Learn on Sicario. So go back and look at all of that material before you come to these slides. Key point here, you don't need to have seen the movie and you do not need to watch it. I've posted it on the resource list, but you don't have to watch Sicario in order to understand what we're talking about in these slides. There's another film, which I'll come to towards the end, where I do recommend that you watch that. And I recommend that you talk about it in your reading group. So after you've looked at the materials on Sicario, come back here and we'll talk a little bit more about more contemporary history, specifically 20th century history, and how all of these things work today in the contemporary US-Mexico borderland context, all right? We're going to talk about a couple of different themes around environment, security, and what life is like for people who live there. So just as a reminder, you've gone away and watched all the material on Sicario. You've come back. Just as a reminder, this is how the borderland is represented in that film. This is a still from the film. Here's another. And here's the final one. So key points to take away here for us, for our purposes. The borderland of Sicario is represented as a Wild West. So think back to what I was saying at the end of the first set of slides. So whenever we see the border in this film, as shown outside Silvio's house here, we're reminded specifically of the region's lawlessness, recalling stories and narratives about the Wild West as a lawless frontier. Sicario captures quite a few of the themes of this set of lecture slides: bodies, drugs, and weapons crossing the border, military technologies that have been appropriated from war zones to turn the borderland into a domestic war zone. The more the government invests in security technology, the more the fear of the enemy grows. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we move through these slides. The landscape of the borderland region extends outward from both sides of the border, right? And the dangerous and questionable morality of each side bleeds into the other in the film Sicario. So Border Patrol can penetrate onto the Mexican side, while the criminality that originates on the Mexican side has made its way to the American side. So think back to Thomas Nail, right? And how borders facilitate movement, right? The border doesn't function like a complete barrier. It is porous in many ways. It's also really important to remember that at its heart, Sicario is ultimately a war movie. It's pitched as an action, adventure, or thriller film, but it is really a war movie, which is why the author of the blog post ties it to Apocalypse Now, which is the most famous American film about the Vietnam War. It presents the US-Mexico borderland region as a war zone. And this is reflective of a wider strand of popular discourse about the border in the United States. And this has profound consequences for the people who actually live in the region, whether they are citizens of the US, of Mexico, or of other countries. And at its heart, Sicario portrays a liberal existential anxiety about the landscape of the border. The landscape is unknowable. It's disorientating. It has the potential to lead to violence at any moment. And the stakes are made higher by the technology and military presence. So rather than acting as a mitigator of violence or a way of making people feel safer, in fact, the technology and military presence on the border makes the landscape more disorientating and more unknowable and therefore more dangerous. The film Sicario takes place in an actual place, El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, which is a massive, sprawling urban region that crosses the border. This is sometimes called the Borderplex, and it sometimes also includes another urban center, Las Cruces, which is in New Mexico. It's one of 14 border cities where the city is divided by the border. So there are actually 14 massive urban centers that are cut in half by the US Mexico border. And they're located, many of them are located on the Rio Grande River. El Paso Ciudad Juarez is located on the border between Texas and the Mexican state of Chihuahua. So El Paso is in Texas. It was called Paso del Norte until 1888. That's where it gets its name. And it was originally founded as a site when the Spanish were looking for a route north through the Rocky Mountains as part of their colonizing process, right? After Tijuana, San Diego, which is the largest metropolitan border region, El Paso is the second largest border region. And it's important also to note that Juarez, which is on the Mexican side, is significantly larger than El Paso. And originally, the region was inhabited by multiple indigenous tribes before the arrival of the Spanish. And when the Spanish arrived, they built a Catholic mission, which was designed specifically to convert native peoples to Catholicism. After Mexican independence and then the annexation of Texas, the city functioned as a single community for a number of decades. So the border was relatively inconsequential in this region in the 19th century. The population grew, industry grew here, so industries included mining, and during the 1920s and 1930s, this part of the border was a hub for bootlegged alcohol during Prohibition. After World War II and the founding of NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, the region became a hub for manufacturing. It's a high altitude region, so it's cold desert, so it's quite a harsh environment here around El Paso Ciudad Juarez. It also represents one of the largest ports of trade between the US and Mexico. So cars, electronics, oil, clothing, and textiles all make their way across the border here. The city is divided by the Rio Grande River, which acts as a physical boundary or a physical border. And the river border begins here in earnest. So the river border kind of travels this way. You can see here. Juarez started to make international news, and particularly in the United States, for quite problematic reasons after 2006, because there were increases in levels of violence and crime, which were tied to the war on drugs, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. The city has multiple possible crossings, and cartel conflicts and government-led military campaigns have led to American and international narratives that paint Juarez as a war zone, as a really violent place. Sicario absolutely subscribes to this narrative. Juarez is also infamous for its gender-based violence, so there are significant numbers of unsolved, inconclusive investigations into the murders of women specifically. So a Mexican journalist and academic named Sergio González Rodriguez began investigating the murders of women in Juarez in 1996 and has published 2 books. But a lot of this work is written in Spanish. It's only more recently that it's been translated into English because community concerns around violence against women in Ciudad Juarez weren't of interest to academics or scholars or kind of popular audiences outside of Spanish-speaking audiences. However, this has started to change. So The Femicide Machine, which is the second book, was recently translated to English. And this book specifically connects the serial killings of women in Juarez, not only to drug traffickers and criminal gangs, but also to what Rodriguez describes as the quote-unquote machines of global capitalism, specifically border technologies that are symptoms of global capitalism that make these killings possible. So war machines, police machines, economic machines, manufacturing machines, security machines, among others. And we'll talk more specifically about what some of those technologies are later in this set of slides and also in slides that come later in the course. So the key argument here is that while popular narratives around the violence against women in Juarez have tended to focus on cartel-based violence or violence that's kind of circling the war on drugs. In fact, they're related far more to the border technologies that are in play here, and specifically to capitalist technology. The border has, from its start, facilitated trade across it. So the border was quite porous for many decades after it was drawn, especially for people traveling across for work. So you wouldn't, in the 19th century, have to go through a checkpoint, for example, in order to cross the border. But the war on drugs changes this. And the war on drugs, quite famously, begins in 1969. It's initiated by Richard Nixon when he enters the White House. If you think about what's happening in 1969, remember, the Vietnam War is going on, and that is a key aspect of American kind of public consciousness. Nixon was determined to prove that he could establish law and order in a nation that seemed to be spinning out of control. So there are protests around rapid changes in social consciousness, right? The gay rights movement has appeared. The Civil Rights Act has just passed in 1965. The feminist movement is working in earnest. There's an anti-war movement that is protesting the war in Vietnam. The nation feels upended, and it feels like it's spinning out of control and in chaos. And one of the conservative responses to this is to establish law and order. Nixon, of course, was a Republican president. Drug treatment and medical approaches to addiction are fledgling, and they're new, and they're not particularly popular in certain political circles. So combating drug addiction was done through targeting the international production and supply of drugs, rather than thinking about drug treatment or thinking about addiction as a disease, for example, right? How we might think about it now. And Mexico is the first target. So one of the first things Nixon does is he creates a narcotics task force, specifically to study the effects and economics of marijuana. And he singles out Mexican producers and smugglers, which he says are the biggest and most dangerous source of marijuana coming into the US. And he uses a language of war. So he decides to, quote, wage a war, which means in practice a crackdown on the border. So he begins Operation Intercept. Operation Intercept produces an unprecedented slowdown of movement across the border. So plane, truck, car, and foot traffic, whether it's considered legitimate or not by the laws of the United States and Mexico, flowing from Mexico into the southern United States. This is a one-way process, very much so. He also sends thousands of extra border customs and immigration agents down to the border, and they're specifically charged with stopping and inspecting anything that moves. The Mexican government was really angry, as were a lot of Mexican communities that rely on crossing the border for work or for trade, right? Previously, bilateral decisions that affected both sides of the border had tended to be made with more diplomacy and with joint consideration. So negotiators would sit down around a table and decide border policy. So to think big picture here, legal and illegal trade across the borders are difficult to determine and facilitate, right? It's actually really hard to determine what counts as legal trade versus what counts as illegal trade. It seems like that binary should be really obvious, but actually it's not. So we've talked about the war on drugs and specifically the movement of illegal drugs across the border. But it isn't just stuff that gets moved. People also move across the border. So the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement is passed in 1942. Think World War II. White American farm workers have been conscripted into the military in order to fight in the Second World War. So they have been shipped overseas, either to Asia or to Europe, to fight in the Second World War. So the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement is passed in order to facilitate the movement of agricultural workers and agricultural specialists from Mexico into the United States. And they agree decent living conditions and a set wage. And at this point, 5 million people cross the border at a rate of about 200,000 a year. And during the war, small numbers are admitted, but the industry really starts to rely on this labor. So the growth in undocumented contracts starts to rise. After the war, the government creates a visa program. This is called the H-2A visa program. If you get into the nitty-gritty kind of reporting on U.S. immigration issues, you start to see the different visa programs appear in the reporting. So I give you a lot of this information. You don't need to remember it, but it might come in handy at some point if you choose to write an essay or a dissertation on this topic. So the H-2A visa program comes into play, and this criminalizes labor that isn't contracted through the government. So we start to see a real binary appear between legal, so-called legal, and so-called illegal employment. And this so-called illegal employment becomes a crime. In 1954, Operation Wetback is instated. Wetback is a really derogatory, cruel, and offensive term that's often used by white people to talk about Mexican people. It's really, really racist. The only reason I'm using it right now is because this is the official term for the operation in 1954, which was the first mass deportation of Mexicans by the US government. Mexican workers were excluded from unions. They weren't allowed to participate in industrial action, and they're paid mandated lower wages. So American farm workers can claim that they are negatively impacted by Mexican workers. Unions then start to campaign against them. And so the program that brings Mexican agricultural workers and specialists into the country ends in 1964. This is the start of a really important and very protracted race-based debate about labor in the United States, particularly around labor coming from Mexico and from Central and South America. So we kind of come to now, to the contemporary moment. All of these issues around drugs and around work and labor are still absolutely relevant. But we also have some other contemporary issues that are also at play. So the environment is absolutely affected and shaped by the border. There's both a physical and a human landscape of the border at play. A decent amount of the border region is national and state park. This is called Big Bend National Park, which runs along the Texas-Mexico border. 19th century boundary making often prized physical geographical features for drawing borders. So rivers and mountain ranges are seen in the 19th century as the most effective type of border, and these are still called, quote, natural borders. And the Rio Grande River acts as nearly half of the U.S.-Mexico border. So having been determined by the 1848 Peace Treaty, which ended the Mexican-American War, bonus points if you can remember what that treaty is called, the border traces the river's deepest channel. And because the riverbed frequently shifts according to the water's whims, this border is, in some respects, notional. So go ahead and take a look. You can pause your slides now, take a break, and then take a look at Nick Baumgarten's New Yorker article, which I've posted in the Learn page. So from that article, he writes, the majority of its length from El Paso to the Gulf of Mexico, with the S-turn of the Big Bend, forms the southern boundary of Texas and of the United States. The river empties into the Gulf just past Brownsville, Texas. No part of the river is like any other. Typically, it's treated more as a managed scheme of discrete local parts. Taos Box, Elephant Butte Reservoir, Big Bend, Lower Canyons, Valle, than as an essential artery feeding a vast corner of our continent and a watershed connecting interdependent ecosystems, cultures, and nations. There's some really serious environmental issues that come along with having a border here, and particularly Trump's wall will massively affect the landscape and will massively affect the environment. Groundwater depletion, suburban sprawl, periodic droughts, which are attributable probably to climate change. Every year, people are asking more of less water. And all of these issues are exacerbated by Trump's wall. We also have biodiversity issues affected by the wall. But there's some really interesting features of Trump's wall that are quite important. So, no one is proposing that a wall be built in the middle of the river, or for that matter on Mexican soil, even if Mexico is going to pay for it. This comes from Nick Baumgarten's article. So the wall would go on the American side, some distance from its banks, miles into U.S. territory, and it would cut people off from their property, and it would cut wildlife from the main and sometimes the only water source in a vast upland desert. And Baumgarten talks about all of the different ways that the environment will be affected. And so the question becomes here, what and who is the wall actually for? If it's going to have such a profound and disastrous effect on people who live in the borderland regions and on the environment of the region, what is it actually for? And this is where we get to securitization. So all of the kind of discourse around the wall is really about security. So border crime is characterized as the illegal smuggling of drugs and weapons and the illegal smuggling of people, although this doesn't really become a massive issue until the 1990s. And in the 1990s, the relationship between labor crossing the border from Mexico and agricultural, construction, and manufacturing industries leads to some desire not to entirely close a porous border, right? Basically, what I mean by this is manufacturers and industries and construction and farmers rely on movement across the border. So there isn't a desire to completely shut down the border. So the government imposes kind of a strategy of creating a balance between keeping so-called illegal, by which I mean undocumented border movement, invisible, in order to placate an urban middle-class anti-immigrant sentiment, which also maintains the possibility for industries to continue to employ migrants. So for example, I'm from California, I'm from Northern California. We have a massive wine industry. Much of the wine industry relies on transnational labor, relies on migrant labor. And a lot of the industry also has relied historically on undocumented labor. So the idea was that you would keep that labor hidden away from white middle class people who don't live in the borderland region. And then you would allow it to keep happening so that the economy can continue to function. So this is really the kind of policy in the 90s, certainly of the Bill Clinton administration. But after 9/11, everything changes. And so we shift to a narrative of counterterrorism. And this is the narrative that shapes the United States' involvement in global politics for the next 20 years. I would argue that Trump has made some changes to this, but this is really the policy. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security is given a mandate to protect the nation from dangerous people and to achieve effective control over borders, right? It's believed that terrorists cross the border into the United States and then enact violence within its borders. So the Department of Homeland Security specifically is created to stop terrorists. And Rhys Jones, who's a geographer based in Hawaii, says that the old proposals to reduce drug and people smuggling are repackaged. They're rebranded as crucial measures for reducing the possibility of a terrorist attack. So the National Guard gets deployed to the border. New border initiatives that had always kind of been on the table but were never funded or rolled out. And these initiatives include smart border technology, new fences, and new barriers. And George W. Bush, the president at the time, creates the War on Terror. And this has come to be known by kind of historians of the contemporary moment as the Bush Doctrine. And according to the Bush Doctrine, the binaries are really clear. Everything is black and white. You have a very clear distinction between good and evil. You're either a terrorist or you're a citizen and a patriot. You're either with us or against us. But if you think back to what we were talking about in the 1990s, this kind of very nebulous, ambiguous relationship between so-called undocumented labor and the US economy, where does Mexico fall here? What is the kind of relationship between illegality and migration and terrorism? And so we start to see discourses of terrorism become enmeshed with discourses of immigration. And this is where terminology is really important. And a lot of terminology here is specifically and purposefully ambiguous. The discourses of border enforcement become enmeshed with discourses of defense, specifically national defense. So Bush imposes policies of preemption, so he closes the border to make sure that terrorists can't make use of legal immigration processes to enter the country. And a lot of Trump's discourse around this is kind of like the Bush doctrine on steroids. It's absolutely conflating immigrants with terrorism. And Said's imaginative geographies of the other with a capital O, are really important here. So the Bush doctrine creates a discourse that constructs immigrants that are crossing the border from the south to the north. And specifically, this is not about people that are moving from the north to the south, because that also happens. But people who move from the south to the north represent an unknown threat lurking on the other side of the border. So think back to Sicario. That threat is absolutely present in the clips from Sicario that you watched. You never know, according to this discourse, if the person you're interacting with is legal or illegal, good or bad, a terrorist or a migrant, right? And because you never know, you have to prepare for the worst. So the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol start to treat the borderland region as a war zone. So one of the interesting things that we see is the arrival of military-grade weapons, military-grade equipment, and military technology that has been practiced and perfected in the war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're actually brought to the US-Mexico border so that migrants and borderland communities are equally affected by this technology, and they're treated the same way that the kind of colonized peoples in Iraq and Afghanistan have been treated. So you can see, right, this is a drone. These drones are usually associated with warfare on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, for example. But this is a U.S. Customs and Border Protection drone, which is used to monitor and surveil the border. But it's really important that we don't think solely in terms of kind of large-scale, state, macro-level processes. That's not the only thing going on here. And there's always resistance, particularly in borderland communities, right? People live here. This is their home. So the anthropologists Hastings Donnan and Thomas Wilson, they study the culture and society of borderlands specifically, and they're really interested in the social relations and cultural practices that crop up in borderland regions. And they are diverse and varied. At times, they reinforced statist policy and thinking. So, for example, in kind of the mid-2000s, I think around 2006, this became really prominent in the news. The so-called Minutemen militia form, which are kind of made up of ranchers and local landowners who live along the border, mostly white guys, right, who act as vigilante ranchers on the border guarding their property. And they use kind of shotguns and other weapons to justify their kind of status as a militia, right? But at other times, these discourses in communities challenge statist policy and thinking. So, for example, this is an annual volleyball game that's played in a border town in Arizona. And it's part of a week-long festival where people on both sides of the border come together, and they have barbecues and they hang out and they play games and they get to know each other. There's also some really interesting artistic work and resistance and activist work that takes place on the border. There's some really important events that have taken place on the US Mexico border recently. So we'll talk in one of our sessions together about a geographer who works for a nonprofit organization that assists migrants who are trying to cross the very harsh desert environment. He was jailed and he was charged with human trafficking. So the United States is actively working to discredit and to control activists who work on the border. We also see street installations and installations for public art. This installation was created by a street artist named JR, who's well known for painting eyes. And JR created a picnic table that crossed the border and then appropriated and flipped on its head the aerial surveillance that Border Patrol enacts in order to surveil the border. So this is a drone image, an image captured by a drone of the picnic that took place on the border. And so the border isn't just a space of division, even as Trump continues to build his wall. It is also a space in which people are actively trying to make connections, and they're actively trying to dismantle some of the statist discourses that think of the border as inherent or as timeless or as necessary, right? So there's always resistance and there's always pushback. I think it was really interesting that just before Brexit, there was a sort of proposal to remember the Cold War picnic of 1989 that took place in Europe, and that the idea that a picnic can bring people together and can also enact political change. 1989, of course, was just before the Berlin Wall fell. So this is the end of these slides for part 2. Go away and have a look at the rest of the materials that you haven't looked at yet. I've also included some really important and interesting data visualization materials put together by academics in the United States that look at the relationship between the family separation camps that have been created on the border and private corporations and private money. So go ahead and take a look at that material. And also I would recommend watching the film El Norte. El Norte is an absolutely groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting film. It was made in 1984. It is still 1,000% relevant. If you can get your hands on it, I would absolutely recommend watching it with your reading group. That's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed some of this material. As usual, I'm available if you have any questions. If you have anything that you want to discuss further, I'm absolutely welcome.